Okay, good morning. My name is Mike Stecher, and I'm here today to give you a quick presentation on the overview of the use of blockchains in pharmaceutical industry. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the background of a blockchain, giving what a definition is and the basic operation of it. We'll talk about a couple of current pharmaceutical blockchain systems, and we'll talk about some future proposed blockchains in the pharmaceutical industry, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So starting with the background, a blockchain definition is it's a system that keeps a record of transactions in multiple computers, and there's no one computer that holds a master copy of the data. And that little picture you see in the middle of the screen here, if you imagine that the blue dots are all different computers that are participating in a blockchain, you can see that every computer talks to every other computer. It's a system where there is no one master system that records everything. A blockchain is identified as a distributed ledger where every computer on it has the complete set of data for the transactions and objects that are being tracked. In comparison, an older style system that's not a blockchain would have a single master copy of the data that would be in one computer, and any other computer that wanted to access the data would have to go to the computer that's doing the master set. So an example of a blockchain that everyone should know about is the Bitcoin, the money that is just recorded out there in the internet on the blockchain, and it's an open blockchain that anybody can decide to go into as long as their computer has enough computing capacity to deal with it. Keeping in the idea of money, a bank would be an older style system where the bank holds a single master copy of all of the accounts and transactions, and if you wanted to see that, you would have to log into the master system or one of the other systems that allows you to view the data. A blockchain has a governance, and it's usually a governance committee that gets together to decide how a blockchain will operate. And while there's a number of questions that might get involved in that, there's a few things that you should always do for every blockchain. So can anyone set up a computer or a node on the blockchain, which means it's public? Or are the nodes only allowed to join a blockchain after they've been vetted by either the governance committee, or if it's large enough, there may be even a membership committee that works on that? And that's a private blockchain. Who can originate data for addition to the blockchain is another thing that you need to define at the start of operation. If you don't know who can originate data, you can't actually run a blockchain because you wouldn't be able to put together the blockchain itself and record anything. How many computers or nodes are allowed on the blockchain? There's usually both a minimum and a maximum number. Because the more computers you have on a blockchain, the better it is at security. Because in order to break a blockchain, you actually have to have control over at least 50% of the nodes. So if you have one node, it's easy to control a blockchain if somebody breaks the node. So most blockchains don't go below, say, 5 nodes. And some of them, obviously, like Bitcoin, can go up quite a bit higher than that. What are the business rules for the blockchain? So when you're recording objects, you're not just necessarily recording the objects, you're recording transactions against the objects, and you're trying to have the business rules set so that you can enforce what transactions can be done to the objects. Going back to the BitChain example, if you have a Bitcoin, you can trade it for something else. If you don't have the Bitcoin, you can't trade it. And that's a business rule that would be enforced by the blockchain. And the last important question, are there any restrictions on who can view data on the blockchain? A public one like the Bitcoin, it might be the only major restriction might be you can't see how much Bitcoin I actually have. But you might be able to see transactions that I've done, particularly transactions that involve you. Before you start actually operating the blockchain, you have to first configure the objects and transactions that are going to be stored. As we talked about in the governance, the business rules are embedded in the blockchain implementation, and they can define who can originate the data, what type of validation must be done prior to data being added, and what types of transactions can be recorded. Now, the picture in the middle of your screen is a very small implementation of a blockchain, a small example. It gives you a block number, a hash, which is an encrypted security code, a timestamp for when the block was added, and the data, which is whatever you're recording in the block itself. And you can see from here it's called a blockchain because each block refers to its predecessor. And it ends up looking like a chain when you look at it in sequence. This is also part of the security of a blockchain. The blockchains itself, the data, once it's been written, anytime you try to change the data, it would mean that the hash encrypted signature no longer matches that block of data. And that means that you can very easily tell that someone has been trying to corrupt your blockchain. And that block could be recovered from one of the other systems once the system that had the bad blockchain realized that there was an error in it. That's one of the security items to prevent anyone from actually changing data after it's been written. Likewise, you can't delete any data after it's been written. If you removed a block from the middle of the blockchain, the chain would no longer exist because the third block in this case would no longer be pointing to the second block that's been deleted. So you've broken the chain. And again, you could be able to recover that from one of the other nodes, assuming that no one managed to break enough nodes to disturb the whole system. So that's a brief explanation of what a blockchain is and how it operates. Now we'll talk about a couple of the pharmaceutical blockchains that are currently in use. Most of the implementations at the moment are related to track and trace systems, so serialization requirements. They've been set up both for use in the US and in the EU, which are the two countries that are farthest along in a general implementation of serialization. A number of different blockchains have been set up for the US DSCSA requirements, and that's their serialization legislation talking about security of their drug supply system. The different blockchains that are set up do not and cannot interact directly because they may be based on different blockchain implementations. They may record information differently. They may actually have different information that they record. Because some of them need to interact, you actually have to set up interfaces between the two blockchains in order to operate. If you don't have that interface, then the two can't talk to each other. Blockchains are being used for track and trace systems for the main parts that the data security. Since we talked about this in the background, you cannot change or delete data once it's been written. It makes it an ideal candidate for doing security-based records of serialized product moving throughout the industry. And on a blockchain, major partners, such as the wholesalers, may actually want to implement a node themselves so that they have the data on their own computer systems on their own premise. And that means that they can access the data directly. They do not have to go out over the internet and lose the speed. All of the wholesalers are saying that when they want to verify a product for US serialization, they want to be able to get that verification happening within a second of scanning the barcode. And all the blockchains for the track and trace systems have been set up as private. So anyone who wants to run a node must apply to the owner of the blockchain or the membership committee of the blockchain and be accepted before they're allowed to set up a node and connect to the blockchain. SAP, which is a major software company in the world, has created a blockchain for the US track and trace requirements. Only the product owner, which is the company that's the marketing authorization holder of the product, is allowed to write data to the blockchain. And this is because this particular instance of the blockchain is only recording the status of the materials at this point, and they're not trying to trace where in the system, in the supply chain, that the product actually is. But anyone in the industry can apply to host a node and have the data on their own site to read. All of the product information is encrypted so that any company that actually wants to read the status of the serial number must know the product identification and be able to encrypt it prior to searching the blockchain to see if the data is there or not. And this is done so that even if somebody manages to break into the blockchain, the serial numbers are all protected, because you can't reverse encrypt the data or decrypt the data. You have to encrypt what you're searching with and then go look for the encrypted copy. With SAP, the data can be written to the blockchain by 3 different methods. SAP also runs a service where product owners can use SAP to transfer the data to their partners. If the product owner does that, then SAP will capture a copy of the data as it moves through their system and write all the products onto their blockchain. Or the product owner could run a blockchain node directly on their own system, and they could write the information directly on their node, which would then cause it to copy out to all the other nodes in the blockchain. And because SAP knows that there are cases where there is no data movement through SAP, or the product owner doesn't run a blockchain, they've also set a special web interface where you can provide the data to SAP and SAP will write to the blockchain. And in terms of this particular implementation, other than the product identification info, there's a current status of the product, which will tell you if the product is still active, or if the product's been dispensed, or it's been decommissioned or destroyed. And the product owner should always update the blockchain to give the most up-to-date data for the status, so that anyone who's looking at the blockchain can see if a particular product has been decommissioned. So if they have that in their hand and they're trying to verify if it's a valid product, it would come back and say it's a valid product, but it would also say it's been decommissioned. So you would be able to tell that there's multiple copies of that same serial number out in the industry, and something needs to be done. You need to quarantine the product you have and get an investigation done to see what's going on. There's another large blockchain that's done by a company called Chronicled, and the blockchain itself is called MediLedger. MediLedger is one of the names that you hear quite often in the industry. And when you dig into the information on MediLedger, it uses blockchain technology, but it doesn't actually meet a traditional definition of a distributed ledger. And that's because MediLedger has taken the route that the product owner will not want to put their information on everybody else's node. So even though it's a blockchain, the node for a product owner site is private. The product owner uploads their product information data to their private node, and the node never copies it to any of the other systems that are on the MediLedger blockchain. So because the identification data is never shared to other nodes, it's not truly a distributed ledger. They do have a second part of their blockchain, which is the record of what product owner is responsible for each product. And that is distributed to all of the nodes. So if you look at the lookup directory, is what it's called, that's on your own node, you will be able to see where you have to direct your query to in order to get the track and trace verification for your serial number. But you won't have the same speed as, say, the SAP ledger, because you still have to go across the internet to reach the owner's private node and get the response. While it's not strictly on topic for this presentation, there are other major companies in the same verification area that have chosen to use traditional computer systems with a master copy of the data that is queried. And I'm just mentioning this to show that there's still no specific consensus in the industry if a blockchain is actually a requirement for the function in the industry. It's something that you have to take a look at, and you have to work with your solution provider to see if there is a true reason for why you should implement a blockchain. Blockchain can cost you a lot of time, effort, and computer resources to operate. So as long as you have enough reason to do it, go ahead and do it. If you can't show a good reason to do it, then you need to sit back and think, are we doing this because blockchain is a bright, new, shiny thing to try? Or is there a real reason for it? Future pharmaceutical blockchains. So there are a number of different companies out there that work with blockchains, and they are currently recommending some future uses for the pharmaceutical industry. Some are being set up right now, and the companies that are setting it up are spending the time and effort to do it, hoping that they can convince the pharmaceutical companies and the rest of the industry that their blockchain is a good reason to use a blockchain, and they would get a head start on their competitors. Some are being discussed in industry working groups. There are a few working groups that are talking about various different items and proposing that a blockchain be set up to be done for that. So they're actually looking at what different types of blockchains could be used. They're looking at what questions a governance committee would set up, and sometimes moving towards the governance committee. So 3 of the major reasons that are being discussed for blockchains in the future. One is supply chain management, and that would include tracking the movement of the product. So not just the serialization that we've been talking about with MediLedger or SAP, but actually tracking the movement of the product. That's currently usually done through business-to-business EDI, but it could be done on a blockchain. And depending on the security assigned to the blockchain, it could be replicated out to all the companies. There just has to be enough security placed on it so that competitors can't read each other's data. And that would be part of the business rules implemented on the blockchain. Another thing that is very near and dear to pharmaceutical companies in supply chain management is storage conditions. Because the pharmaceutical companies have to ensure that as products move back and forth in the supply chain, they try and track the storage condition. If you were to write that information to a blockchain, the security and the protection against deletion or change provide a very good reason for doing storage conditions here. Financial arrangements is another one. Chronicled in particular is suggesting be done. And they're looking at tracking and processing of rebates and chargebacks. Again, this one seems like a kind of odd thing because you wouldn't want to share that data across the whole industry. So either they would likely go into the private nodes that they've done with MediLedger, or they would go into security rules so that only the participants of a particular transaction can see it. And the last one that people are looking at is clinical trials. And this has a lot of push on it right now because a lot of the major regulatory authorities like the US FDA and the EMA from EU and the MHRA from Britain are looking at clinical trials and trying to come up with ways to ensure that consent is being recorded and the actual data from the execution of the trial can't be deleted or modified if it doesn't happen to meet what the clinical trials people are thinking it should. So a blockchain is a very good method for that, simply for the security and the fact that you could conceivably work with the regulatory authority so they have their own node on the blockchain and they could read the data directly. So again, while the ideas on the previous slide do have valid requirements for the data security, it's doubtful that any of them would truly become a distributed ledger for the entire industry. The nature of the information means that it would be likely that companies would be hesitant to have this information shared everywhere, at least until the blockchain implementations are proven and can be shown that they can actually have the security, that the data is out there, but the people who aren't supposed to read it cannot read it. It's more likely that a blockchain implementation would end up similar to MediLedger, where even though the blockchain is shared among different companies, the sensitive data remains on private nodes or it's more controlled by the companies involved in that particular data. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I certainly hope that you've learned something. And at this point in time, we can take some questions.